Hi there. Thank you very much, Anna, for introducing us and for hosting this webinar. It's a very big pleasure for us to be here today and to talk about such an important topic as men's accountability towards women as an ongoing process. My name is Natalia, and I come from Unizon. And here is my colleague, WWP.
Hi, I'm WWP from MÄN. Hi.
Hi. So we will start with a few brief words about our home organizations, the organizations that we are representing. I come from Unizon, which is the Swedish National Association for Women's Shelters, Young Women Empowerment Centers, crisis centers for youth, and other support services. We are the movement that is constantly growing, and right now we are over 140 shelters and crisis centers located around the whole country. Here on the slide you can see the map of Sweden and where our shelters and crisis centers are located. So as the National Association, we do not work directly with women and children subjected to men's violence. So it's our member organizations that work with support and protection of women, young women and children subjected to men's violence. And together with them, we work on advocacy and on violence prevention. Using the experiences and the knowledge that our crisis centers, our shelters, our member organizations gain throughout their daily work with victims and survivors of men's violence. And we together work for a gender equal society free from violence.
Yes, and men for gender equality, um, against men's violence, and for transforming masculinity. MÄN is a non-profit member-based organization founded in 1993, and we have about 1,500 members throughout Sweden, with around 15 different local organizations. It's growing. And we have a national office in Stockholm with 30 employed staff, and we work a lot nationally and also a bit internationally with cooperation projects and in networks. And our vision is as well an equal world free from violence. And our main focus is to engage boys and men for gender equality, and finding ways to engage them, to act, to change, both change others and change themselves. So we believe very much that the political is personal. So you have to work with individual change and society change. And a lot of the work we do is primary prevention. And the whole field of work with perpetrators is somehow new. We are developing now some work with young boys perpetrators. It's in development right now, but in our international cooperation projects, especially with Russia, we have supported and been very much part of developing work with perpetrators and how to do that in an accountable way. We are a feminist organization, and we work together with the women's movement, and we see that everything we do is built on the base of all the struggles that the women's organizations have been doing, and we're changing norms of masculinities and patriarchy. Yes.
Yeah, so as Vidar said, we have been working together for many years against men's violence against women and towards a gender equal society. And when I talk about Unizon and our work, the work of our member organizations, it is very important to stress that in the very center of our work, there are women and children subjected to men's violence, and everything we do, we're doing for their best to change the situation for them and the situation in the society in general. And when it comes to cooperation with organizations working with men, it is very important for us to declare and to make sure that uh, they have the same standpoint as we do, and that they put women's and children's interests in the very center of their work. So that's why you can see here a schematic picture of the approach that we have. That it's very important that the gender conscious work with men, gender conscious work with male perpetrators of violence, and the gender conscious work on violence prevention. It means at the very end a better situation for women and children subjected to men's violence, and the work for their best, for their interests.
And we are members of a global organization and network called Men Engage. It's about 700 member organizations globally, including different UN bodies and so on. And the whole work on accountability toward the women's organizations and the women and children subjected to men's violence is very key in the network, and an important and alive question, also combined with a lot of awareness of that there is a lot of blind spots that we have to constantly work on in this area. But we have accountability standards and guidelines and toolkits, and here are some quotes from the accountability standards. So yeah, I'll just read them. So Men Engage recognizes that its work was born out of a feminist tradition, and that women-led organizations have carried out the foundational gender work. We strive to complement and expand the work promoted by women's rights organizations by engaging men and boys. In this context, accountability to the women's movement and to other historically oppressed social groups is a necessary practice for building collaborative and equitable partnerships. So this question of what it means to be accountable, and what men's accountability to means, it's on all levels. So both on the international network level, the regional networks, the organizational network level, and also down to the personal level. So there is not a difference here between a professional person and a private person. You have to be accountable all the way through. And part of being accountable means to be critically aware of one's own power and privilege, and open to constructive criticism. And we will come back to that for sure when we share our own examples. Taking action to address personal and institutional practices that go against principles of gender equality and human rights, acknowledging any harm caused, and making amends. Yeah, so these are different steps, and I think making amends, the one in the end there is very important, and and difficult. Respecting and promoting women's leadership in the gender equality movement, creating structures of consultation and partnerships with women's rights organizations. So, for example, for men, we make sure that in our board there is always at least one person who is from the women's shelters movement. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. So why are we talking today about accountability as an ongoing process? Why do we think that it's important to acknowledge different steps on the way to accountability? Well, simply because we are working very hard, Unizon and MÄN, together on achieving this accountable way of cooperation and achieving the way of cooperation that would create a better society free from violence for children and for women. And that is a truly ongoing process for our organizations because I'm not really sure if there is a possibility to be to come to the end of this process and to ever be ready with all this accountability work. So we take it step by step, and sometimes it goes very well, and sometimes we experience some problems. So today, we think it's very important to talk about the challenges or the problems that we have experienced with our work in order to illustrate the way how you can face this problem and how you can find the ways out of it towards the more accountable cooperation.
Yes, so we will share one concrete example and process. And it started, wow, no, is it 3 years ago? 2 years, 2.5 years ago. It was a situation when Unizon was about to publish an article about pornography, and they asked us as men and a close ally and partner to sign the article, to stand behind it together with Unizon and together with other organizations. And MÄN was not really acting in an accountable way in this situation. We were way too slow to respond. We were way too slow to process and understand how important this was, and that we were backing this, and instead went into different discussions and internally around whether we were ready or not to take a stand in this question, and we ended up saying no to signing this article. That in itself was I think influenced the trust that Unizon had in MÄN very severely. There was a trust that we were listening to what was important for them and what they see and how they analyze the situation and what is urgent and important to have to bring up in the public discussion, and they counted on us to back them, but we didn't. But that was not all, and it was maybe not the worst thing. The worst thing was that we also did not follow up on this. So there were, in different phases, promises made by MÄN that we will make sure to think through and to answer and come back, to cooperate on this, and we never did. It took a long time, and there was also seminars that we were having together where Unizon had to stand alone in this issue, and we were not there backing. I think we were basically a bit afraid of this very hot and difficult issue, and Unizon was standing there alone, taking all the criticism. Yeah, and this went on for more than half a year, that men did not come back in a sufficient and accountable way to even ask Unizon, so what happened here? How was this for you? How can we repair this, or what can we do? But time went by, and the trust from Unizon became smaller and smaller, and more hurt. And we came to a situation where there was one person in the steering committee at MÄN who said, hey, listen here, now we are receiving criticism from Unizon to why we didn't act in an accountable way, and the way we are responding is to defend ourselves. We can't continue doing that. We have to move closer. We have to, when distance is growing, we have to step closer and listen and ask questions, not just try to protect or defend or explain ourselves. I think that was one very important first step in changing from not being accountable to work on being more accountable. And there was a meeting where men met with Unizon and took a more clearly listening position, and then brought that back home. I think, yeah, then Unizon was also honest and shared. So men got to hear the harm that we had caused, and then men went back home and processed this, and it was also not an easy thing. We really had difficulties. There were members of the board who left the board, and so it was a painful and difficult process. But we step by step landed in that we then could invite Unizon for a meeting, and where men shared what we had understood, the whole process of what we saw that we had caused, how that had affected Unizon, and apologized. And I remember the last 30 minutes before this meeting, it was still hard to really fully take that step totally, because there was still some kind of defense, like, yeah, but they are very offensive to us now, criticizing us too hard, it's not fair, and all of that stuff. And just to let all of that go and realize that, okay, we have to take in, listen, and apologize, and realize and really stand for that. We do see that we have done something wrong here. That's the only possibility to try to start to become more accountable. During that meeting, Unizon did something beautiful. They said, okay, we hear you. You do realize what you did. You do apologize. Well done. That's a hard thing to do. The trust is not fully rebuilt. Now you have to prove and show. Because what MÄN also did was to then, this is about making amends. We also shared a plan with very specific concrete steps for what we now wanted to do to repair things, which was different parts. One of them was to finally invite MÄN, Unizon to do the training for the MÄN organization about pornography, which we had said long time ago that we wanted, but we never did. That was one important step. And how we wanted to make sure that we take responsibility in backing Unizon in the pornography question, not leave them alone there. And then I think we are still in the process of proving that we can be accountable and trustworthy. It's still not fully repaired, I think, but it's moving step by step, and also it's still in the situation where if we make a small mistake, that opens up old wounds. So we have to have a very open conversation about this all the time, and also never think that we are now good at this. But there are so many blind spots, and we have to do that difficult thing of being open to criticism, and even if that criticism is not even if that is not expressed in a constructive way, if that is the case, sometimes maybe that's when it's even more important to listen, because that maybe means that there is a lot of reasons for criticism and anger and frustration. Yeah, I think I stop there right now.
Thank you very much, Vidar. Well, it's difficult to add something else, because we're describe the situation that we experienced very well in details. It is very interesting that we work with such topics and issues as gender equality and men's violence against women. And we see actually the same dynamics in the relationships between our organizations as the dynamics that exist in the society as a whole between women and men. And when you start realizing it, it helps somehow to also talk about it and try to find solutions, because that's actually like the situation between MÄN and Unizon that Vidar described practically could be a situation between a woman and a man that we, from our organizational standpoints, could try to help to handle. And now we are ourselves in this kind of situation where the trust was practically distort or hurt, and then when you are in the process of building this trust again. And from the Unizon's perspective, as Vidar said, it's hard to say that the trust is fully reconstructed, but we do appreciate all the steps towards the more accountable, more open ways of cooperation, towards more listening, and towards the greater attempts for understanding. Because it's very important also in terms of open communication, not only that the it is very important to be able to give this constructive criticism, to talk about the important things that we probably do not share, we're not satisfied with. This openness gives us an opportunity to really speak up and to share what we think is important. And then we're very grateful that the organization MÄN does listen and does take the steps towards rebuilding the trust again. We would be very grateful for your questions and probably your reflections over the things that we were talking about. What we wanted to say in the end, to sum up, is that it's very important to have some guiding principles for men's accountability. Some of them Vidar already talked about and described. And here you can see some more very practical things that we think are important. For instance, making the work and history of women's movement visible, because it is important to acknowledge that the women's movement paved the way for enabling the work on masculinity norms, on violence prevention, work with perpetrators possible. Then it's important to keep the feminist analysis of men's violence. And here we would like to stress that it's important not only to see the violence as an individual problem, but to move over to the societal level and to see the structures behind men's violence against women, to have the gender and power analysis of it. Men need to take responsibility for own position and patriarchy, as Vidar already said. Then it was a very telling example on accountability in the question of pornography that we do. Because it is usually this way that women's movement takes the most difficult questions and then receives a lot of criticism for that. So when we talk about pornography, when we started talking about pornography in 2017, we got a lot of criticism, a lot of hate that we experienced mostly from men in the society. And in this situation, it won't be even, it would be very helpful if men stood by our side. And it would be even more helpful if men took these questions themselves as well. So here it's important to decide also sometimes who talks about what and who presents what kind of topics. For instance, when we do the presentation, who talks about work with fathers and who talks about pornography, for instance. And then a very practical but very important question that brings us back to why we are doing this work, that we have women and children subjected to men's violence in the center of our work. And that is never accept funding if there is no sufficient funding available for women's shelter movement. It is essential because if we don't have enough money, enough resources to support women and children, then we shouldn't in the society go further and allocate a lot of resources towards prevention work, work with perpetrators, work with others, and so on. So women and children should be guaranteed the help and the support that they need in the first place. So now we are ready to take questions. Anna, will you help us with that?
Of course. I have a first question, which I think is very interesting. The participant, Alessandra, is asking for a bit more information of how the process of recognizing the difficulties went on within MÄN, what made it possible to change the ideas and positions, and what was the process that enabled that to happen, Vida?
Yes, I'll try. One very important thing was that we were several, both members and staff at MÄN, who really saw the pornography as the question of pornography as crucial, as men's violence against women and as a driver of men's violence against women. So in the internal processes that were going on, there was definitely pressure from inside that we have to take more responsibility regarding this. We have to be more accountable and support and back up Unizon. There was a big and is a big admiration to the work that Unizon is doing, which is very brave and really changing things in Sweden on this area and internationally as well. So that was one very important thing that made the change possible. And we did have some individuals then that were more hesitant to take that step. And as I said, some people in the steering committee left the organization because they didn't agree to this. And that's the whole thing around that pornography. That it does exist some pornography that is feminist, and we can't stop all pornography and that kind of discussion. But Unizon is very clear that this is about mainstream pornography, which is very, very violent. That's what we need to work. And then I hope, and I think I dare to say, that there is a culture within the organization MÄN which is about listening and self-reflection and accountability. So when that person in the steering committee said, "Hey, stop! We have to move closer and listen here," that there was a culture prepared as a base for that, to take that step. And also the whole thing in the whole work with engaging men for gender equality, vulnerability is one important thing. To create safe spaces where men can open up and be more vulnerable and not just stuck in the traditional norms and being hardened. All of that. I think that also helped a lot. So we could kind of remind ourselves of our basic values and remind ourselves to act more according to them. And of course, one important thing was that we had this very, very long relationship with Unizon, and it was so painful to really see that we had hurt it severely. I mean, we were kind of, I think maybe it's comparable to the situations when men come for treatment as perpetrators. When they realize that the woman is about to divorce and leave them, that's when they wake up. I think that actually true here too. I know that our director at the office, she was so sad and frustrated and kind of reflecting and sharing that if I during my work here has been part of ruining that relation, that is then I really have failed, and we as an organization have. Yeah, I think I stopped there.
Yes, thank you very much. We had another question come in from Natasha, and she asked, I'm going to publish it. And I think, Natasha, we're going to need a little bit of explanation on what you mean with a model. She asked, do you think this model can work in other European countries? Are you planning to expand it to other countries as well? I think the last part of the question you can already answer because you've been doing international work. But I think, Natasha, if you could briefly take a moment to explain which model you mean. Natalia Vida, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing around accountability internationally?
Yes, thank you for a very interesting question. Well, we talk about accountability a lot with different partner organizations in the networks that we work in WWP, in MÄN Engage, and so on. And also, as Vidar said, we do cooperate with some organizations in Russia, and there we do some training, accountability training, where we focus on practically very basics of accountability. We start from the very beginning because it's important for us to make sure that when we talk about accountability, we are all on the same page. So we cannot really proceed on developing models of addressing certain issues in accountable ways before we create this mutual understanding on what accountability means and on which level accountability exists. So by now, for instance, in Russia, we've done 2 accountability trainings where we were focusing on accountability on these different levels, on the societal level, the structural level, on the organizational level, and on the personal or individual level, and how you practically start moving from the realizing your own accountability on the individual level, making the step towards the organizational accountability and accountability in more general terms. So that's what we've done so far. And of course, this process should be also led by it cannot be led by our organizations, because the processes need to be adapted or adjusted to the national, local context. And what is important here is to, by creating the understanding of accountability, we try to create the understanding about why it is important to talk about accountability and to work on it. And then, at least I see that it is important for local organizations to take over and having these basics, like the basic understanding of accountability, build their own structures and their own models.
Just to add to that, like men engage.
Vida, you need to get closer to the microphone.
Okay, yeah, I'm trying. The technical problems.
Speak a
I
little
hope
bit.
you can hear me now. Yeah, can you hear me
Try.
now?
Not really.
Not really. Wow. I'm really yelling so the whole office can hear me here. Can you hear me now?
No.
No.
Maybe go a bit further away from the computer.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Just to add to what Natalia said, the Men Engage network has developed, as I said before, accountability standards, code of conduct, and also accountability toolkits for organizations and regional networks and so on to develop their own accountability standards. So there are some tools for this available, and you can find it on the Men Engage network. And there is a constant ongoing work, really, step by step, in developing the knowledge in this area and the experiences, and a lot of ongoing discussions globally among the different organizations working to engage men and boys for gender equality and stop men's violence against women. So both the tools and the ongoing discussions that are also documented, you can find them and read them there, are very useful.
Yes, and I would like to stress over again that it is important to have the basic discussion and to have the understanding of what accountability is before starting applying these tools and developing the models. Because if there is no understanding, and if the organizations are not
Natalia, I can't hear you very well.
Okay, and now?
Speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yes. Okay. So I'm not really sure when you lost me, but
maybe start again with building the basis.
Yes. So it is important to to build this basis of understanding what accountability is, and to make sure that the organizations that you work together with are on the same page when it comes to the understanding of accountability and why it is important. Otherwise, as we can see in our work, like going further with adjusting to or using toolkits, developing structures or models can be counterproductive, because first, this basic understanding of accountability is not there yet. So before creating models, there should be a very thorough dialogue on the on the meaning and importance of accountability.
Okay,
Thank
you very much. I had a question, and I was wondering, maybe not in this context, because I think it's a very basic philosophical disagreement that you had, but I was wondering, what could a process of accountable disagreement look like? What do you think? You've had this process, it's an ongoing process, so there will be maybe some topics that you can't agree on. So what do you think would feel like an accountable process of disagreement?
Very good question.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to start, or I can just say? It is a very difficult question, but I think an accountable disagreement for me would be the disagreement, like the open communication. When you listen to each other's arguments and you make attempts to understand, because like it's easier for me to kind of see in practice what an unaccountable disagreement looks like and feels like, and it's when you give the perspective, often the perspective of women's movement, or even the perspective of a woman, and then instead of being met with questions, questions about clarification of something, you are met with more argument in defense of a certain position that, for instance, men's-led organizations have. And this kind of closeness doesn't provide for like creating this accountable disagreement, because you need to start listening to each other first, and then you can find your way.
Vida, do you have anything to add?
Yeah.
He's talking now.
I am talking.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
no.
Yeah. So I'll try again. So you can
I
end
can hear
up
you now.
you can end up in a disagreement, but if you have really listened to each other and feel heard, then that could be something like an accountable disagreement. I'm trying to think of specific examples, but I can't really find one right now. Did you have something specific in mind?
No, I did not. I was just thinking about it, and I can't come up with an example either. But I think it's yeah.
It's really a way of how you do things. Just like it is possible to listen to criticism, even if it's not expressed in a constructive way, but with a lot of frustration, it is still possible to listen and try to understand. So how come there is so much frustration and anger here? Maybe it has something to do with what I have done. I'm not just going to defensive mood and say you have to be constructive in your criticism, otherwise I won't listen. The way of doing things is accountable.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one last question that you already got into. Unless, Natalia, did you want to add anything?
No, thank you.
Okay, and as you already mentioned, some resources that organizations could look at. Could you maybe mention them briefly again so people could write them down? Warning, get your pencils. Or any additional resources that you think would be good to look at?
I think the Men Engage work and tools and ongoing published discussions on men's accountability is really useful. And I know that, for example, the global network of of women's shelters organizations when we were at the conference there. That was some years ago. They were highlighting that Men Engage is doing this work. Maybe the women's organizations should also start to develop more of texts and things on men's accountability. Unizon have done that a bit, and one of the slides, the last slide is from that. Maybe is that something you can share?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not really. Okay. Yes. So if you can contact us and we can send the additional information to and the text that we developed. We do work also together with WWP on the question of accountability. So I believe that Anna and your colleagues from WWP can also share some texts and tips with you.
Yes.
Yeah, but anyway, you will be yeah, you will have an access, I guess, to our presentation and to the tips and important moments that were listed in the presentation, and then you can just contact us for additional information. We are very happy to send it to you.